Out of all these different ideas and debates, we see these distinct denominations emerging.
You're right.
And the first one we've got here is Lutheranism, founded by Martin Luther,
Okay.
a former Roman Catholic monk, your notes point out.
Right.
And his big thing was the Bible as the ultimate guide,
Uh-huh.
which obviously clashed with certain church doctrines.
What's really interesting is that Luther's initial goal was to reform the church from within,
Yeah,
not necessarily to break away,
right.
but his emphasis on this like direct connection between the individual and God through Scripture.
Yeah.
It really resonated with people, particularly in Northern Europe,
Hmm.
the Holy Roman Empire, Scandinavia, places like that.
Right.
And I think the political landscape there played a role too, because it was much more decentralized,
Mm-hmm.
which meant local rulers had more freedom to embrace these new ideas.
Interesting. Okay, and then we have Reformed theology with John Calvin,
Right.
a lawyer.
Yeah.
And the notes emphasize that this wasn't just a new church, it was like a whole new theological system.
A comprehensive system.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the most striking aspects is that heavy emphasis on predestination.
Uh-huh.
The idea that God has already determined who will be saved, and a more limited view of free will.
It sounds like a pretty significant step away from even Luther's ideas.
It was a major shift. You're absolutely right. If Lutheranism was about the authority of Scripture and justification by faith,
Uh-huh.
Calvin's Reformed theology offered a much more systematic,
Yeah.
and you could argue a more radical understanding of God's sovereignty.
And that's found a following in places like Scotland.
Exactly. Scotland, smaller communities scattered throughout Europe.
Got it. And then last but not least, we have the English Reformation and the Church of England,
Okay.
started by King Henry VIII. And it's interesting because doctrinally it stayed pretty close to Roman Catholicism.
Right.
So the driving forces there seem to be way more personal, political, economic, Henry wanting that divorce,
Uh-huh.
asserting his authority, grabbing church land.
Yeah, unlike those theological debates that fueled the Lutheran and Reform movements,
Right.
the English Reformation was more about the king's ambitions.
Yeah.
I mean, later on there were some theological changes, but that initial break was about power and
Yeah.
personal desires, not really about fundamental disagreements over doctrine.
So we've got Lutheranism emphasizing scripture, taking root in Northern Europe,
Yep.
Reformed theology focusing on God's sovereignty, finding a home in Scotland,
Uh-huh.
and then the Church of England kind of driven by Henry's needs, staying pretty close to Catholic doctrine.
Right.
It's amazing how these three distinct paths emerged.
And what's really crucial to grasp is that all these factors were intertwined.
Yeah,
The theological, the political, the personal,
right.
they all shaped the religious landscape of Europe in ways that we still see today.
It really is. It really makes you think about how these historical debates
Yeah.
about faith versus works free will versus divine control, they still resonate today.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in different forms, but those questions are still relevant to how people approach faith and belief in our own time.
They are.
Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. It's been really insightful.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening.
Take care.
Bye.